further ado, I'm very proud to introduce Clint Mueller.
Thank you, Murray. Well, good afternoon, everybody. Good afternoon. Now that your bellies are full and you've had a full morning of a lot of very detailed information, you get to spend the afternoon talking about taxes and finance. What could be more fun than that? However, if you don't know this already, you will find it out very shortly that the one thing that you can do in political office to keep you from coming back is to mess up when it comes to finances and taxation, right? I mean, if you look at what you're going to be doing while you're in office, the most important job that you will have is managing that county budget. That's job number one. There's two components to that budget. There's the revenue side and the expenditure side, and they go hand in hand. You can't do one without the other. I like to hear people talk about cutting taxes and increasing services and increasing expenditures. That's a lie, unless you're in the federal government. Now, they've found a way to do it. But you all, unlike the federal government, have to have a balanced budget. That's state law. So you have to balance those revenues and expenditures on an annual basis. You don't have the luxury of going out and issuing a bunch of debt to China and other countries. So we're going to spend some time today talking about the revenue side of the equation. But as I'm talking about the revenue side of the equation, keep in mind, again, it's hand in hand with the expenditure side. You know, I love it down at the state capitol when legislators come up to me and talk about cutting this type of tax or that type of tax, cutting or creating new types of exemptions on you all at the local level, because politically it's easy to cut the tax of another level of government when they're the ones now that have to figure out how to absorb that in the budget and cut expenditures, and they can then take the political credit for cutting the taxes without having to take the tough decision of, now how do I absorb that? What are the expenditure cuts I have to make? So I tell them all the time, I say, you guys, you know, if you're going to make a cut that's going to affect the local revenues, why don't you all find a way to cut some expenditures or some mandates on the counties at the same time? Otherwise, it's your local officials that are going to be in that hot seat. And that's a very difficult place to be in. So, you know, when you all are out there meeting with your constituents, I'm sure many of you all did on the campaign trail when you talked about certain taxes that you wanted to cut and change. You also need to be talking about, okay, now what expenditures are you going to cut so you can reduce those revenues? And vice versa, if you reduce expenditures, then taxes automatically should go down. So again, there's a direct connection between the two. You can't talk about one without the other. Now, before I get started, I just wanted to put a plug in for the policy staff at ACCG. I know that they were introduced to you the first day here, but I want to encourage you as newly elected officials to get involved in our 7 standing policy committees at ACCG. I promise you, you will learn a ton at those committee meetings. We'd love to have you too at the state capitol. So during the legislative session, if you want to come to the state capitol one day, please give me a call. Give one of our policy staff a call. Tell them you're coming. And we'll be there to show you around, to get you engaged in the process, to make sure you're meeting with the right people, depending on what issue you may be interested in down there at the Capitol. We'd love to have you. The more county commissioners that we can have visible at the state Capitol, the better that we're going to have representation for the counties. Because at the end of the day, they really don't care much about what I say, because I don't vote for them. You vote for them. And not only do you vote for them, but you represent a lot of the same constituents that vote for them. And so your word carries a lot of weight in the community. And they know that. And that's really the power of the grassroots effort of our association. So I encourage you to get actively involved. I've heard this before too. Well, I'm going to wait until I get my basic training certification, or I'm going to wait till I go through training and then I'll get involved in the committee process. Don't do that. Don't wait. Some of the best ideas may come from some of the new folks that you know, you haven't been on the inside, so you're bringing a lot of fresh ideas to the table. We want to hear those. So get involved in the policy committee meetings at ACCG. Now, before I get into the actual presentation, let's do a short little quiz. See how much you all know about taxation in the state of Georgia. Can anybody tell me the only county in the state of Georgia that has a true assessment freeze? In other words, the value of the properties, once the property is bought, cannot go up until that property is sold. Anybody back here? Chatham County, nope. Anybody else? That's it, Muskogee County. Now, Chatham County does have what we call a floating homestead exemption, which is very similar to that, but it's not a true assessment freeze. They do it through the floating homestead. Can anybody tell me what are the 3 counties in the state of Georgia that do not have a sales tax that is used to offset operational costs for a county or a school and goes to help alleviate property tax burden? In other words, they're using a sales tax to supplant property tax dollars in some way. There's 3 of them. Anybody? Gwinnett, that's one. Who? Miller, no. Hall, no.
I know some that ought to have it.
Nope. Gwinnett was mentioned. The other 2 are Cobb and Cherokee. Everybody else in this state has either a county city lost tax, which rolls back property taxes. They have an e-lost, which rolls back school property taxes, or they have a host, which rolls back property taxes on homesteaded property. And there's 2 of those, Rockdale and DeKalb. Okay, can anybody tell me and this answer actually has already been given while you've been here, so see if you were paying attention. What is the only fee that you can put a lien on somebody's property if they don't pay it? Only one fee in Georgia. Garbage fee. That's the only one. You can't lien against property for any other type of fee other than garbage. Tell me, there's 2 counties in the state of Georgia that have 2 losts, 2 of those 1-cent sales taxes that help roll back property taxes. What are the 2 counties that have 2 lost taxes? Anybody? Nope. No, they don't have any. They're one of those 3 that did 0. Towns County and Columbus Muskogee. Now, Towns has 1 E lost and 1 county lost, and Columbus Muskogee has 2 county lost. They did it through special legislation. Well, actually, in Columbus's case, it's through general legislation that was tied to a number of factors that they could only meet. In Towns County, I believe they had a local constitutional amendment for their E lost. So, no. Well, let me clear this up real quick. Everything's on the table and everything's an option if you can do one of 2 things. It's either going to require a lot of times a change to state law or the Constitution. But yeah, everything you want to do, when it comes to taxation can probably be done. It's just a matter of, if you can't do it on your own locally, you're probably going to have your local delegation and others pass either local legislation or general law changes or the constitutional changes. What really gets a lot of people is a lot of what you want to do, especially with property tax, requires changes to our state constitution. And by the way, I mentioned the local constitutional amendment. Those are no longer allowed anymore. That used to be a way to sort of amend the Constitution just for your county, but you can't do those anymore.
Do you know of 159 counties, how many have the senior exemption of school tax?
So the question is, of the 159 counties, how many have the senior exemption for school taxes? I don't know off the top of my head. There's quite a number of them, and there's all different flavors. From Cherokee and Cobb, that if you're over the age, I think, of 62, you pay 0 school property taxes. Now, Cherokee, I think they got an income threshold in there, but a lot of others have, make it over a certain amount, or there's all kinds of variations of that. Those are all local homestead exemptions, which means you got to pass local legislation at the General Assembly to set up the referendum, and it's got to pass in a referendum, and then so yeah, every one of you is very unique when it comes to your different homestead exemptions. There's a few homestead exemptions that are statewide, but most of them are local. One more question. Okay.
Just one moment, sir. Just repeat the question, please.
Okay, on local option to roll back property tax. I know we agreed on that through state referendum one time. Now, do the counties have that individually? I didn't understand you completely
No.
with your answer. Okay.
No.
Okay.
There's only 3 counties that have that option on the table right now. That's Cherokee, Cobb, and Gwinnett. You've already got one. So you can't do another one. Without a change to state law, you can't do it. Yeah, because they've gotten law changes to allow them to do that don't apply to you. Okay, one more question. I actually wasn't going to take questions right now, but we'll or else I may never get through this. But
I have more of a statement regarding his question. Gilmer County passed a 100% 65 and over school tax exemption, and it's a disaster. We've had people combining parcels to get around the system. We've got a 21-acre trailer park that's school tax exempt, 11 commercial properties, and because of the way the legislation was crafted, there's nothing we can do about it.
yeah, well, you know, that's a very good point for all of you. You all are policymakers now that you're county commissioners. And when you set policy, it goes well beyond your term in office. You're going to be affecting the county and the citizens of your community years into the future, and especially when you're talking about tax policy. You all know when you open the door, when you open that barn door, it doesn't close. Anytime you give a tax break, people will scream if you take it away. It's one thing never to have given it, but once you give it and you try to take it away in any way, they scream bloody murder, and you all know that. So you think very carefully when you're doing that kind of thing, and go ahead and plan that once you put it in place that you may never get rid of it. I was talking to the mayor of Columbus, Muskogee many times since she was in office, and she's trying to figure out a way to convert what she's got into something else. And it's extremely difficult because people, it gets entrenched. Let me grab my clicker here. A couple other little things I'll tell you when it comes to tax policy. Some people, you'll hear this term, tax reform, revenue neutral. There's no such thing as revenue neutral. It's always going to bring in more or less. And there's definitely no such thing as revenue neutral when you get down to the individual. Anytime you make a change to tax policy locally, you are going to affect the distribution of that tax burden in your community. You are creating winners and losers. The decisions you make will create winners and losers. You're going to have some people that are going to love you for it, and some people that are going to hate you for it. That's just how it is. There's no such thing as win-win. You know, we'll talk more about some of these new taxes coming on board next year that you're going to be dealing with, such as the new vehicle title tax and energy excise tax and Freeport 2. And I can tell you with all those, there's real consequences. You know, with Freeport 2, you're talking about business inventory. Well, if you give them a break, you're shifting that tax burden to everybody else. You may say, oh, we're going to absorb it in our budget. We're going to cut our expenditures. Well, if you can cut your expenditures, then if you hadn't given that tax break, then you should cut your expenditures, and then everybody else would have gotten less, paid less in taxes, right? But because you've now given that exemption, even if you cut your expenditures, it's still everybody else is paying more. So, you know, word of advice, when you all vote on some of these referendum questions, do the fiscal analysis for yourself. Because a lot of times you guys are voting for things that are detrimental to you from your own personal financial stance. I'll give you another good example. There was a bill several years ago that passed, a Forest Land Protection Act, and it was on the statewide ballot, and it basically said you want to preserve trees, forest land. It was, you know, worded in such a way it was conservation. But I can tell you that unless you owned tracts of forest land of 200 acres or more, you're paying the freight for that exemption now. Unless you're one of the beneficiaries, you're one of the ones that are going to now have to pay the bill. Let's talk about legal authority to impose revenues of any kind. You got to always start with the state constitution. Article 9, Section 2, Paragraph 1. That's the home rule provisions. That's basically talking about what you guys can do on your own. And then Article 9, Section 4, Paragraph 1 talks about taxing authority. Without getting into the details of the wording, I'm just going to tell you this. You all are subdivisions of the state, and when it comes to taxation, there's very little that you can do on your own that you're not authorized to do. Pretty much any kind of tax, the General Assembly or our Constitution has to have given you the authority to either ask the voters or to do it on your own. But you can't just come up with taxes on your own and say, I'd like to create a new tax that I think works best for my community, and we're going to just adopt an ordinance to create a new tax. You can't do that. Now with fees, you got a little bit more flexibility. With fees, you can, there's not a whole lot said in state law about fees, but where there is something in state law about a fee, you can't go outside those bounds. Let's take 911 fees. 911 fees are addressed in state law. So you guys can't just levy your own type of 911 fee or do it your own rate or whatever. You've got to abide by what the law says on 911. But let's take Parks and Rec. There's nothing in the law about what you can and can't do as far as charging fees for Parks and Rec. So that's free game. You can do some of that. So in fact, some of our counties, quite frankly, have gotten very creative over the last few years because they've been trying to, again, keep down property taxes and fund some of these services. And they've moved to more of a fee-based system because it does give them more flexibility with sort of how they distribute that tax burden. Take fire, for example. We've got a number of counties that have taken fire out of the property tax, and now they charge it as a fee. What do they do when they charge it for the fee? Now they can charge it based on square footage of the dwelling, based on ISO rating. They can charge it based on none of the exemptions in the property tax code now apply, so churches pay it. Everybody pays it. And so that's, if you're looking for flexibility and you're looking for alternatives that you have at the local level, it's probably going to be in the fee category. Now, I know some of you are saying, well, fees, taxes, aren't they, they keep mixing these terms, but is a fee a tax? Well, it really is. You really are treating a fee like a tax if you're forcing people to pay it. I mean, if it was truly a fee, then there would be this voluntary exchange. In other words, here's the fee. If you pay it, I'll give you this. You don't have to pay it if you don't want that service. But we're going to talk about some fees in a little while, and you're going to see that a lot of these fees that we call fees, politically it sounds nice, but they're really taxes because you're forcing people to pay it, just like that fire fee. If you don't have a choice and you've got to pay it, then it's probably really not a fee. But it does give you a lot more flexibility. Special purposes of county taxes, that's in state law. You can see all the purposes. Basically, you all, again, have a lot of overlap with the cities. You can basically do anything that the cities do, but then you have to do a lot of things by state law that the cities do not have to do. So you guys are really the core level of local government. I mean, you're doing the things, you're not doing the wants, you're doing all the needs. And then you may do some wants on top of that, but you have no choice when it comes to providing the funding for the jail, for the courts, for the constitutional officers, for deed records, all that stuff. You have to do it, which makes your job very difficult when you're dealing with the budget because the discretionary part of your budget is going to be much, much smaller than, say, what a city council deals with. Because so much of this stuff is really dictated to you by state. And then the last C there is the part of the Constitution that talks about special service districts, special tax districts. This is also a place where you've got a lot of flexibility because under the special service districts and tax districts, you can sort of geographically segment out parts of your county to charge property taxes, special assessments, fees. And so that gives you some flexibility to maybe provide different levels of service in different areas of the county. So if you've got a fast-growing part of the county and they want, say, a full-blown fire department, but the other part of the county wants to keep it rural and they're fine with a volunteer fire department. Well, through special tax districts, you can provide those different levels of service and fund that level of service from that geographic area. Now, I know this is the smaller counties in here, under 40,000, I believe. So I know a lot of you all may only have a general M&O levy. But you're not precluded from adding other levies on your tax bill. I mean, you can set up special services. In fact, sometimes you can set up a special service district that's county-wide. So it doesn't even have to be a subset of the county. One place you can't do that, and this has already been tried, was we had a county that tried to set the sheriff up as a special county-wide tax district. And the reason for that is they wanted to break out the sheriff's millage, how much their sheriff's office is costing property taxpayers, and put it separate on that tax bill. Sheriff sued them, went all the way to the Georgia Supreme Court. The sheriff won because he's a constitutional officer. But you could do that with other types of things like fire, anything that's when you're not dealing with a constitutional officer. So I know this is going to be very different probably from your county because this is working off some statewide average numbers. But it kind of gives you a sense of sort of the makeup of county revenues. Obviously, the number one revenue source is property tax. That's probably the case for just probably every county in here. Second largest revenue source is sales tax. And then you get into all the different fees and grants and licensing, permit fees, and all that other stuff. And we're going to talk about some of this. So what I'm going to do first, I'm going to start with the larger one and talk about property tax. And then I'm going to talk about sales tax. I'm going to take questions after each one of these. And then hopefully we'll be able to get to some of these new taxes. Now the property tax, politically, this is the one that people hate the most, right? I mean, of all the taxes and revenues that you generate for your county, what's the one that they scream about the loudest? It's the property tax. And I can tell you that the general public doesn't understand the property tax system and how it works. They don't understand that there's this board of assessors that's got some independence from the board of commissioners, and they set values, and if you've got a problem with your value, you go there. And then the tax commissioner is the one that sends the bill, and they've got some autonomy from the board of commissioners. And the county commissioners only set the millage rate for the county. However, because they're the levying authority for the school, whatever the school recommends, they have to levy. You can't change it. And the cities then, obviously, they set their own millage rate. And many times you all get blamed for whatever happens. If it's something with the tax commissioner or something with the assessors or something with another level of government, a lot of times they're blaming you for that. So what you all need to do is make sure you work real hard to continue to educate your public on the whole property tax system, because it is a very complex and confusing system. And we're going to show a video here, and this is something that you all are the first ones to see in the state. We just finished this property tax video. And this is a tool for you. It's not to educate you about property tax, it's to educate your citizens. So this is the kind of thing that you can take back, and you've got a copy of it. You should have got a copy when you came in. If you didn't, get one when you go out. But this is the kind of thing that you can show at the Rotary Club, civic clubs, and I think it really demonstrates to the public what they're getting back in return for the property taxes they're paying to your county. Go ahead.
From peaceful mountain towns to bustling metropolitan areas to small farming communities, Georgia is a great place to live and work and raise a family. Across the state, the places we call home have their own distinctive characteristics, each as unique and interesting as the people who live there. But as much as we appreciate the differences in our communities, there's one thing we expect all of them to have in common. We want them to offer us a good quality of life. And for that, we rely in large part on our local governments. From strong public schools to job opportunities. From reliable public safety to well-maintained roads and bridges. From facilities like libraries and public health centers to diverse recreational opportunities. Counties, cities, and schools around Georgia provide the services that keep our communities safe, clean, comfortable, and prosperous. The role of local governments is to provide services that enhance the quality of life and protect the health and safety of citizens. But how do we pay for all these services? In large part, it's through our property taxes. Local governments, our counties, cities, and schools use these taxes to finance services that add value to our property. Things like fire protection and law enforcement, parks and land use planning and zoning, sidewalks and storm drainage systems, the construction and maintenance of infrastructure like roads and bridges, and trash collection and animal control. Across the state, property taxes represent the largest local source of revenue for local governments.
So I need to pay my property taxes. Okay.
It's through our property taxes that we have local control over the services we use on a daily basis, things that directly affect our quality of life. But what does that mean for you and me? What value do we really get for our tax dollars? While individual bills vary, on average, a Georgia family pays a little more than $1,500 a year in all county, city, and school property taxes. Of that $1,500, what they pay to support roads maintenance for a year is about the cost of a couple of oil changes. Their contribution for library services, it's less than what you'd spend on one hardback book. What they pay for the county health department, about the cost of a bottle of cough syrup. And their share of courts and jails for a year, it's what they spend for 3 months of a private home security system. Across the state, every county operates in its own way. So the amount you pay and the benefits you receive depend on which county you live in. Some services, including courts and jails, emergency management and vital records archives for birth and death certificates and marriage licenses, are required by state law. Every county must provide these. Others, like libraries or parks, are discretionary. They are the ones we as citizens want in our communities, but not necessarily something the county is required to provide. But how do we know we're getting what we pay for? And how do we know that what we're paying is fair? For most of us, our home is our most important asset, and it's the most expensive investment we'll ever make. So the property taxes we pay, in essence, they're an insurance policy on our investment, because they pay for the county's services that help protect our property. Every property tax bill reflects several different components. In addition to our county taxes, if we live in a city, we may pay city taxes as well. We're also billed for schools, which represent the largest portion of the property tax bill, as much as 2/3 of the total amount. When our county commission, city council, and school board adopt these budgets each year, they take into consideration requests and recommendations from citizens, as well as expenditures required by the state or federal governments.
I have a motion and a second. Any discussion? All in favor say aye.
Then they estimate how much can be raised from sources like sales taxes, business taxes, and user fees. The remainder of the budget comes from property taxes. To calculate the tax rate, the percentage that will be charged, the amount needed from property taxes is divided by the total value of all taxable property in the county. This total value, also known as the County Tax Digest, includes not just homes, but businesses, apartments, industrial property, and farmland as well. The tax rate, that is the percentage we pay, is stated in terms of mills, with a mill equal to $1 per $1,000 of assessed property value. For tax purposes, state law requires property to be assessed at 40% of its fair market value. So, if your home is worth $100,000, its assessed value is $40,000. This is the value used to calculate your property taxes. But other factors affect what you're charged. There are various exemptions that can be deducted from the $40,000. For example, the state general homestead exemption, some local homestead exemptions, and exemptions for people over the age 62, and for disabled veterans. So to calculate your total taxable assessed value, you first subtract the exemptions from your home's $40,000 value. Let's say you qualify for a $5,000 homestead exemption, and you're eligible for a $1,000 exemption because you're 62 or older. Now, deduct these amounts, and the value you're taxed on comes to $34,000. Then, to determine how much you owe, you multiply the assessed value of your property by the millage rates set by the county, school board, and city. So, who are the players in the tax process? The Georgia Constitution requires that all property be valued in a uniform manner. And the Georgia legislature enacts property tax laws that determine which properties are taxed and which are exempt. Your Board of Tax Assessors is required by law to value your property at its current market value. To do this, the board hires a state-trained appraisal staff. The state enforces the requirement that appraisals be kept at market value by levying a fine on counties that don't keep property values current. Your county commissioners administer the property tax system in your county, but they have no role in appraising, billing, or collecting property taxes. The County Board of Tax Assessors and the Tax Commissioner carry out those functions independently of the county commissioners. The Tax Commissioner, an official you elect, sends you your tax bill and collects taxes. He or she then distributes the money to the school board, county government, and city governments. But what if you think your contribution in local property taxes is unfair? What recourse do you have? Well, first, make sure you review your annual property assessment notice as soon as you receive it. This notice is distributed in late spring to early summer, and you have 45 days from the time you receive it to exercise your right to appeal. Your first step is to appeal to your local Board of Assessors. If your concerns are not satisfied at this level, there are a number of options for furthering your appeal up to and including filing a complaint in Superior Court. Your assessment notice provides a list of your options for appeal. It also includes an estimate of your property taxes that you will owe at the end of the year. If you have concerns about the millage rate, contact the county commissioners, school board, or city officials who adopted the budget that led to the millage rate. You may also get many of your questions answered by looking on your county's website. Tax bills are distributed towards the end of the year. This is not the time to appeal your property's value. That must be done when the assessment notice is received. However, if you think there are errors in your tax bill, or if you have a question about your bill, you should contact the Tax Commissioner's office. As Georgia's population continues to grow, our counties, cities, and school boards are required to provide more services for more people. Governments are called on to do more with less. So in the end, it's really a matter of balance. If we feel that our property taxes are too high, we're unhappy. But if they're too low, we don't receive the services that support the quality of life we all desire. Schools, law enforcement, ambulance service, fire protection, emergency management, garbage collection and disposal, road construction and maintenance, public transportation, water treatment and water supply, stormwater and sewage systems, animal control, public health centers, libraries, archives, parks and recreational facilities. The list of services our counties deliver goes on and on. Not every citizen in every county will use all the services the county offers. But all of them, like our courts and jails or recreation facilities and infrastructure development, help shape the identity of our communities and help create a sense of place that lets us know this is where we belong. So whether you live in a big city or a small town, whether you're in the mountains of North Georgia or in the rural areas of the South, the next time you pay your property taxes, think about all the benefits they provide. They're an investment you make in your home, your neighborhood, your community. And they are an investment that pays off day after day, year after year, by protecting the things that are most important to you: your home, your family, and your quality of life. For more information, visit us at factsaboutpropertytax.com.
It's always dangerous to turn out the lights after lunch. I hope you all were able to stay awake during that video. And I hope you find that you'll find that that's going to be a useful tool for you as a communications tool with your citizens. I think we don't do nearly enough in government to communicate on a regular basis with the citizens about what it is we're trying to accomplish and what it is that, that they're investing in their community. Every one of you all is a citizen in your community, and every one of you all probably ran because your community is important to you, and you want to make a difference in your community. You want your community to succeed. You want that quality of life that you desire, not only for you but for your children. And a lot of that is done through the budget and county services, and of course the major funding source for you is the property tax. So people need to make those connections. We actually stole some of that in the video from an idea that Cobb County came up with. They went through their services, the cost of every service and how much of it is paid for through property taxes. And they took the average value home in their county. And they said, okay, here's how much an average value homeowner pays. And then they broke up of that amount, how much of it's going to fire, parks, libraries, and all of that. And then they equated it with other things that you and I buy on a daily basis to kind of drive home the point that, you know, you are getting quite a lot for your money. I mean, look at the roads. You ride on those every single day, right? And only a small fraction of what you pay is going to the roads, but you have access to those. I don't think the public thinks of it in those terms. And so these numbers obviously are statewide numbers that we're using in this video. They're not Cobb County numbers. And obviously, county by county, your property values and the amount of taxes that are paid vary greatly. But it does demonstrate that if you start breaking it out of all the things the counties do and all the things they're funding with your property tax bill, it's quite a lot. I'm going to be hitting you at the 5,000-foot level on property taxes. I don't have time to go into a lot of detail today. We do have a 2-day course that we offer on nothing but property taxes. And I hope that some of you all will be able to take that. In fact, I think now it's a mandatory course as part of the basic certification. So most of you all will go through that, and you'll get a lot more in-depth discussion on the property tax system. But I wanted to just kind of real quickly go through the property tax system and point out a few things to you. There has been a number of changes to the property tax laws in Georgia, quite a number that went into effect last year. So some of this stuff is pretty new. So types of property. Real property, that's where most of the property taxes come from. And there's different types of real property. You got residential, commercial, agriculture, industrial. That's why, from an economic development standpoint, you guys want the industrial and commercial and sort of the non-residential properties in your county, because politically, if you're lucky enough to, say, have a electric generation facility for Georgia Power in your community, that's a good thing. You're less reliant on property taxes from the homeowners, and politically that makes a lot of sense. I know Burke County's got those 2 nuclear reactors going in addition to the ones they already have. That county, everybody's probably should be envious of Burke County having those kinds of property tax assets in their community. Personal property, business inventory, vehicles, boats, cell towers. This is the movable property, the property that's not, you know, affixed to the ground. This makes up a lot smaller piece of the property tax. And, you know, some of this stuff is being looked at, especially on the business inventory side. Most of you all have what we call Freeport 1, and then there was a law just passed this year, went into effect this summer, to allow you to do what they call Freeport 2, which is basically get rid of all business inventory taxes. And so you're going to hear about that, I'm sure, from your chambers of commerce, and they're going to claim it's, you know, an economic competitive advantage if you do that. And you don't have to do that, by the way, but you know, over time, a lot of people have already implemented what they call Freeport 1. And I'll talk a little bit more about Freeport. But mobile homes, you know, a lot of people, you can treat those as real or personal property, by the way. So it depends if it's if the owner owns the land underneath it, and if the mobile home's affixed to the land or not, versus if it's in a mobile home park, then it's, you know, it's personal property. And then you got public utilities, railroads, airlines. These types of properties are valued by the Department of Revenue, and the personal property components and the real property components of these things are all valued together. In other words, what they're doing is they're valuing the whole business, the real property as well as personal property. But you have very little control over these values. Now, I will say that the Department of Revenue sends you these values on an annual basis, and you have some ability to change them, but in practice, nobody does, because you guys don't have the expertise in your county to change and then defend if you're challenged. You know, if Georgia Power challenges you and says you didn't value their property correctly, then you got to go to court and defend that. So most counties just take whatever the state gives them. And I know a lot of you all have complained sometimes about the utility digest and how late it comes out, and that's been a problem for several years now, that getting those digests late. And then you've also complained by some of the values that they've placed on those properties. But that's really an issue you need to be working with the State Department of Revenue on if you don't like the values of these types of properties. And then you've got intangible tax. We don't have a lot of the intangible property tax that we used to have, but we still have some relics left. Recording tax and transfer tax. You know, the recording tax, that's the tax you pay when you file your mortgage deed, and then the transfer tax, anytime real estate's transferred, that's paid. So there's a little bit of revenue there. But that's all that comes under property tax. Let's talk a little bit about the property tax cycle. Now in Georgia, the budget cycles are different by county. Some of you all operate on the calendar fiscal year. Some of you operate on the state fiscal year. Some of you operate on the federal fiscal year. And some of you all have other types of fiscal years. Now most of you, it's calendar or state. But the point I want to make is your budget cycle is different from county to county. Your tax cycle is the same for all 159 counties. So what you'll find is your tax cycle lines up differently with your budget cycle depending on your situation in your county. We've got counties that collect their property taxes before their budget year begins, so they've got the money all up front. We've got counties that collect it sometime in the middle of their budget year, so they've got to have some money to get them by until the property taxes come in. And then we've got a few counties that collect it on the rear end. So actually their budget year is over before they collect the property taxes to fund that year, and they're having to pay, basically reimburse themselves for all the money they paid out over the course of the year. And so where that gets into something that you as a policymaker has to think about is cash flow, obviously. You know, if you're one of those that it's in the middle of your year where the property taxes come in or at the end of your budget year, you're probably going to have to either have larger reserves or you're going to have to take out tax anticipation notes and that kind of thing. But I just want to point out the fact that your budget and tax cycle can line up differently. Now let's talk about the tax cycle. All property is valued as of January 1. So actually, is Enos in here? One of our staff members came in one day and she brought me a property tax bill and she said, wow, she says, is this right? I'm getting this good of a deal? I think her property tax bill is like $90. And I looked at it and immediately I said, this is a new home, isn't it? Yeah. I said, when was this thing built? In the summertime? Yeah. I said, it was just a lot there January 1. That's why. I said, don't count on that. And I said, to go ahead and next year know that you're getting a break this year because as of January 1, that was just an empty lot. Next year, though, you're going to get the full value, which is going to be substantially more. So you need to budget more than that. So everything is based on January 1, which is another reason why the business inventory tax for businesses, they hate it so much because guess what happens right before January 1? That's the Christmas season. That's their busiest time of year. That's when they're trying to increase their inventories, right? And so as soon as Christmas is over, what do? They try to reduce their inventories as much as they can by having all these sales and things because they're trying to drop inventories before that January 1 date because that's when you're going to hit them. That's what matters. So after January 1, between January 1 and March 1 is what we call the return period. In other words, everybody in here that owns property has the ability to tell the county what you think your property is worth every year by filing a return. But in most cases, most of you all don't do that, and most people don't even know about the return process. However, businesses do. A lot of businesses will do that. But everybody in here has the ability to file a return every year. And once you file that return, the county tax assessors have to respond. They either have to agree with you or send you back something different. So that's your first opportunity, actually, for appeal. If you don't think when you get your tax bill at the end of the year, if you don't think it's right, if you don't think the value's right, really your first option is to file that return. And it's also the same period of time that you have for filing your homestead exemptions. Now, several years ago, the law was changed to allow you to file homestead exemptions year-round. But if you don't file your homestead exemption prior to March 1, say you come in April and file your homestead exemption, it won't count for that property tax year. They'll keep it on file, and if you're still living there next year, then you'll get it. But you'll have to wait. So you got to get it in by that March 1 deadline. Talk a little bit about valuation and assessment. This is the one area where most people get upset because of the subjectivity of it. There is no way to truly know what a property is worth until that property sells. So what your assessors are doing is they're trying to, on a mass appraisal basis now, trying to determine what values are in your county. So Unlike when you buy a home and you have to get an appraiser to come in where they actually look specifically at your property and compare it to other similar properties in the area, that's a much more detailed level of appraisal. Your assessors are doing mass appraisal, so they're trying to value lots of properties using computers, and very rarely do they go out and actually inspect the property. When you talk about countywide revaluation, when they actually go out and take measurements and inspect the property, for some of you, that may only happen once every 10 years. Some of you may do it once every 3 years. Hardly anybody does it. I don't know of any kind that does it every year. Now, they will adjust values every year based on their computer models, but as far as going out and looking at all the properties, that's something that happens pretty infrequently. There's different methods of valuation. As you heard in the video, you've got the fair market value, and then it's assessed at 40% of fair market value. However, you've got ag preferential, you've got residential transitional, and some other types of property where it's something other than 40%. But the standard is 40%. And I know somebody's going to ask me, well, why 40%? Why don't we just, value it at 100% and tax on 100%? Well, it goes back years ago in Georgia where we had factoring, and we got rid of the factoring system because it wasn't legal. And at that time, most of that properties were being valued at approximately 40% of what they were really worth. So the legislature, I think, just did the easy thing and said, okay, everything's going to be now assessed at 40% of market value. One day I'd like to see that change. I think most other states, it's millage rate or percent or whatever applied to 100% of market value instead of this 40%. But to do that, we have to go and make many, many changes to state law. And of course, there's got to be a transition period where you guys can't take the windfall. You got to reduce the millage rates equivalently. So it's not as easy as it sounds to do. Timber. One thing about timber, this law was changed not too many years ago, and at one time we valued the trees and the land together. Now the land and the trees are valued separately. The land is valued every year, but the trees are only valued for tax purposes at the time they're cut. So what that means is your assessors should not be including the value of the timber product on top of that land when they're doing that annual assessment. And another thing it means, especially for some of you all in here, is that you've got to try to determine when trees are cut so you can get the taxes off of it. And that's not easy to do sometimes. Some of you have a permitting system that people are required before they cut timber to get that permit. Others do not. But even if you have a permit system, you still got to kind of police that because they may not be pulling the permit that they're supposed to pull before they cut the trees. And so I know that's difficult. I know some counties have tried to use aerial photography and change detection software to determine when trees have been cut. But there's probably still a lot we need to do in trying to determine, to make it fair for everybody that cuts timber, that the taxes are getting collected every time the timber is cut. Annual notices. This is something new. At one time, you only had to send a assessment notice to the property owner if you changed the value of their property. Now, you have to send an annual assessment notice to every property owner every single year. So why did the legislature do that? Well, think about where we've been for the past 3 years. Values in most places are not going up, right? They've been going down. So what happened was a lot of counties said, wow, not only is it going to save us money not to have to reassess property, we can sit back and do absolutely nothing, just leave the values where they're at, and leaving them where they're at is going to put us in the best situation, right, financially. So a lot of property owners started complaining to members of the General Assembly saying, look, I got my property tax bill this year, and it's valued at what it was last year. And I asked them, and I think my value has gone down since last year, and I went to the county and said, this is not the correct value. I think I want to appeal this. And the county said, no, you missed your opportunity to file an appeal. And so they said, well, how did I file an appeal? Well, you would have had to file a return last year. Well, most people don't know about the return process. So if you don't get an assessment notice, then the only way you can appeal is going through the return process, which most people don't know about. So in effect, what was happening was a lot of property owners were getting very upset because they're saying, look, my value's going down, I'm getting my tax bill, and I feel like I never had recourse, never had an opportunity to tell the county that I think that the value that's on my property is unfair. And so that's why the General Assembly is now requiring all counties to send out an assessment notice to every property owner, because that automatically, every time you get an assessment notice, it automatically gives you that 45-day window to file an appeal. So everybody is put on notice every single year. here's what we have as the value of your property, and if you don't agree, you got 45 days to challenge it. Let's talk a little bit about the appeals process. So the assessment notices are going out April, May, June, that time frame. It's different for different counties, but that's kind of the general time frame that these assessment notices go out. So when you receive your assessment notice in the mail, it's got the estimated, what the value that they're going to tax you on unless it gets changed. And there's also an estimated tax on there. So basically they're using last year's millage rate to determine if nothing changes, this is what they estimate you'll pay in taxes at the end of the year. Other states do it. Florida calls it a trim notice, but that's to put the public on notice as to what they may expect to pay in taxes if that value doesn't change. Of course, you all can still change the millage rate, which can affect that, positive or negative, because a lot of times the millage rate setting comes after that. So if you want to appeal your value, the first thing you do is you appeal to the Board of Assessors in that 45-day period. And then the Board of Assessors, they look at your appeal and they make a decision. And if they decide to change your value at all, they send you what they call a 30-day notice. And then when you get that 30-day notice, you have to decide if you like that value that they changed it to, or if you still disagree, then you continue your appeal. But you've got to be proactive. If you get that 30-day notice and don't do nothing, your appeal goes away. But if you want to continue the appeal, then it goes to the next step. And now in Georgia, we have some different options as to how you can appeal. It used to primarily be just to the Board of Equalization, which is appointed by your grand jury. So it's a group of citizens that have some very limited training that kind of sit as a jury, and they hear from the Board of Assessors, they hear from the taxpayer, and they actually make a final decision. If the taxpayer doesn't like that decision or the county does not like that decision, it can then go into the courts. It could be appealed into Superior Court. But here are the new options. Just came into effect last year. Binding arbitration. Now, binding arbitration is supposed to be an expedited process. Instead of having your Board of Equalization, which I think is usually 3 members, with binding arbitration, you got a single person, but they have a lot more education when it comes to appraising property. So these are people that are certified appraisers that do this work. And you can go before this process, and they will issue a decision. But when they issue that decision, it's over. The county cannot appeal it and take you to Superior Court, and the property taxpayer cannot appeal it and take it to Superior Court. It's done. It's over with. To go through this process, though, you have to have your own appraisal done on your property. Now, that maybe you may have just refinanced your property, and you got an appraisal, and you can use that. Or you can just go out and pay for an appraisal. But you do have to, so there's a cost potentially associated with getting that appraisal. And I can tell you, if you got a valid appraisal, most of the time, they're going to change it. They're not going to even go to the arbitrator. Only if they think you've got a bogus appraisal will they actually send it before an arbitrator. So for those of you, I know that a lot of people have refinanced recently. So if you've refinanced recently, and that appraisal that you got when you refinance is lower than the value that they have on your property, it'd be a good idea to ask the Board of Assessors to change that. And if they won't change it, file for arbitration, submit your appraisal, you'll probably get it. The hearing officer. Now, this is not open for everybody. This hearing officer option, it's for non-homesteaded property, and it's property that's valued at $1 million or greater. This is for your more complex types of property. This is for your commercial and your industrial, those things that are a little bit more complex, because the person that's the hearing officer has got a whole lot more expertise than your Board of Equalization. These are people that have been trained in appraising the type of property that's being appealed. So if the property that's being appealed is a commercial retail center, then it's some appraiser that's got that experience appraising commercial type of retail. Now at the end of this process, either side can go to Superior Court. But the likelihood of going to Superior Court after a hearing officer is much less than the likelihood of going to Superior Court after the BOE hearing. Because again, with the BOE, they have very little experience, and a lot of times they, quite frankly, don't know what they're doing. And a lot of times one side or the other will appeal it. But when you get a hearing officer decision, you're probably getting a pretty good decision. So the likelihood of the courts changing it is not great. So most times it gets settled right here. So those are the different appeal options that people have. So after After the appeal window is closed, obviously it could take quite a while to settle all the appeals, but you all have the ability to go ahead and set the millage rate and then go to the Department of Revenue to get your digest approved. I will tell you, though, that you want to be careful about setting that millage rate if you've got more than, say, 5% of your values in an appeal, because that's a lot of unknown out there. You may win on half and lose on half, but if it, worst case scenario, you lose on all of it, it could really affect your revenue stream. So by law, you can go ahead and set your millage rate. You can go ahead and start sending out property tax bills, but it's not a good idea to do it unless you really know that the majority of the appeals, I'd say at least 95% of them, have been settled. Otherwise, if you can't get your value settled, you can get a temporary, what they call a temporary collection order from your Superior Court judge. So you set your millage rate, and you have to do it, and the schools have to do it, and you have to comply with what we call Taxpayer Bill of Rights. And that means if you're increasing your millage rate, or if your values have gone up and you haven't rolled back your millage rate, then you have to have the 3 public hearings. You have to have the notice of property tax increase in the paper. So there's those things that you have to go through. If you have not raised the millage rate, or if you've rolled it back to the required rollback rate, you still have to have a public meeting when you adopt, public hearing before you adopt your millage rate. But you don't have to have all the notices in the newspaper that you have to have with Taxpayer Bill of Rights. So after you've done that, your tax commissioner then submits your digest to the Department of Revenue. It's due by August 1, although I can tell you most counties don't get it in by August 1. I think this year only 25 of the 159 counties made the August 1 deadline. So we're working on that legislatively because of the complexity and all the things that go into preparing that digest, all the new laws. It's made it tougher and tougher for counties to meet that August 1 deadline. So what happens if you don't meet it? There's some receiver commissions that are supposed to go to your tax commissioner, and those are lost. But the Department of Revenue can grant extensions, and typically they do. If you can show good cause for why you're late, they can grant you an extension, and they can grant you several extensions, and that's usually what happens. So once the digest is approved, then collections can begin. The tax commissioner sends out the tax bills. They always bill for the schools. Your schools do pay you a fee for that. It's up to 2.5%. Sometimes it's less, depending on whether you have local legislation or have made a policy decision to reduce it locally. Your tax commissioner may or may not collect for the cities. Now, if they decide, if say the cities want them to collect and the tax commissioner is willing to do it, they can do that, but there has to be a contract, and you've got to be party to that contract, so they can't do it without your permission. So it's got to be an agreement between the city, the tax commissioner, and the county commissioners to collect the city property taxes. I will suggest, though, that that's a very efficient way to do it. I mean, there's no sense in the cities reinventing the wheel when you've got the infrastructure in place to collect their taxes. It makes a lot of sense to do that. Installment billing. This is something that's new. A few years ago, most of you could only bill one bill a year. There was a few counties in here that had special legislation that allowed you to do split billing, where you could send out half the bill and then send out the other half at the end of the year. Now it's kind of wide open. You can send out, you can do it in multiple installments. However, there's a cost associated with that, as you know. There's the mailing of this stuff out and then getting it in multiple payments. There's more administrative burden. But it can be done now legally. You all as policymakers can make the decision to bill more than just once at the end of the year. And of course, when does property taxes typically come due? Right around Christmas, which is probably the worst time to pay a big lump sum. I know a lot of people escrow, but those that don't escrow, that could be several $1,000s right around Christmas time. That's not ideal. So sometimes counties, what they'll do is they'll try to allow for the payments to come in earlier, come in early in the fall, and allow for more billing options. So that's something you may want to think about as a policymaker. Penalties and interest. I think this question came up earlier about the tax commissioner and whether they have the authority to waive penalties and interest. You all, as policymakers, have to decide what kind of authority they have. You can give them carte blanche authority to waive penalties and interest. That's not a good idea, I'll tell you. Now, I would suggest giving them that authority if it's an error that they made, then they ought to be able to waive the penalty and interest. But if it's not an error, if it's just a hardship case, that probably needs to go back to you all But you all do have that authority to waive penalties and interest, but you need to have a policy in place. You don't want to be accused of waiving their penalty and interest and not theirs just because, and then you find out they had the same situation. Why are you treating me differently? You better have a policy in place that dictates when it's appropriate and when it's not appropriate to waive penalties and interest. And of course, the ultimate penalty and one of the other reasons people hate property taxes is if they don't pay it, what can you do? You can sell their house on the courthouse steps. This is the thing that a lot of people really, really don't like philosophically about property taxes. But I guess the plus side of it is it's probably the one revenue out there that there's very little avoidance, tax avoidance. You know, with sales tax and other income tax and things like that, there's kind of ways to cheat the system. With property tax, not a whole lot of ways to cheat the system. But you do want to monitor your delinquency rates. Some of you have some high delinquency rates. I can tell you that, you know, when you start your collections by the due date, you may be at 94, 95%. But then several months after that, you should be, you know, 98, 99%. But those of you that are down in the in the 80s or low 90s, you got problems. You need to be talking to your tax commissioners. You shouldn't have those kind of delinquency rates. You know, within a few months after the deadline, you should be getting close to that 97, 98% collection rate. Talk about some special assessments. Everybody heard of conservation use valuation, CUVA? That's a real popular program out there in the rural areas, isn't it, with agriculture. It dramatically lowers the value of the property in a lot of cases. And again, here's another case where the State Department of Revenue determines the values. There's a formula that they use, and it's based on production of the land and how productive it is. And those of you that are in the CUVA program probably have seen this. But the counties aren't setting this assessment value. The Department of Revenue is. And it's usually much less than say, fair market value. Not only that, but really what makes it less is there's a cap on it. You can never go up more than like 3% in any given year. So that cap over time keeps that value artificially low. It's killing you? Well, for the rural counties, it does take a lot of value off your tax digest. I can tell you some counties, some commissioners have said, we need to do away with this. And you're not going to ever do away with it, I promise you that. It's here for good. Just to give you a quick story. Several years ago, I had a commissioner that was real passionate about this. And he said, well, at least we ought to be able to set a minimum. And so we did. We put a minimum in law of 25 acres. But as soon as the renewal started kicking in, and those people that were under 25 acres, and it was voluntary, so it was county by county had to make the decision whether they wanted to set that. But as soon as the renewals kicked in and they found out that they could no longer renew because they were under 25 acres, they were screaming to the legislature. Well, that law got overturned. You can't do it anymore. You can't set that 25 minimum acre. So this is something that does take a lot of value off your tax digest, and it's very visible. You can see how much it takes off your tax digest. Of course, the argument, I'm sure, from the landowner side is they're not heavy users of your services. Therefore, they should get the break. Under 10 acres, there's some additional information you can require of them, but there is no minimum. You could qualify with 1 acre, I guess. If you're showing that you've got ag production going on 1 acre, and you can supply that additional information to prove that you got an ag production use, you can qualify. Oh, sorry. The question was, is there any minimum now? In other words, a lot of people think that you have to have 10 acres or more. I think that's the perception. But that is not law. It can be anything less than 10 acres. It's just in law, at the 10-acre threshold, the county assessors can start requiring more information to prove that you got a true agricultural production use going on. Yes?
They have a training program for us poor dumb rookies about this property conservation use valuation and the forest land and ag preferential.
Yes, we do. I mentioned it earlier. We have a 2-day for those of you that didn't hear the question is about training on this. We do have a 2-day course, and we go into a whole lot more detail. I've only got an hour and 15 minutes today, and I'm only spending part of my time on property taxes. But yes, we do have that course, and I encourage all of y'all to go through that, because whether you're interested in it personally or not doesn't matter. Your constituents are, and you need to be able to kind of answer their questions, because they're going to come to you and ask these questions. Forest Land Protection Act. This is one of the newer ones. This is for timber property, and you know, the CUVA, you have to be a family-owned type of farm. But with this, you can be a corporation and get into it. So it's anything over 200 acres, and there's no cap. You know, with CUVA, there's that 2,000 acre cap. You can put up to 2,000 acres in it, and you have to put that covenant for 10 years. With this, there is no cap. You can put hundreds and thousands of acres in it. But it's a 15-year covenant, and the penalties are a little higher if you get out of this covenant. And, oh, I didn't ask this question at the beginning. This pertains to this, so I'll ask this trivia question. The only state grant to county governments that's constitutionally mandated. Anybody know? This is it. The Forest Land Protection Act grant. They pay for part of this. You're not paying the whole freight for this. Unlike the CUVA program, where you do pay 100% of the cost of people going into that program, the county is only subsidizing part of the cost of people going into this program. So up to the first 3% valuation on your digest, the state picks up half the tab, you pick up the other half. Everything over 3%, they're picking up 100% of the tab. They're paying you for this. Okay, don't tell any legislators I said this, but if you can convince your assessors to encourage people that qualify for the Forest Land Protection Act but are in CUVA to move from CUVA to forest land, now you got the state paying part of the bill. Question back in the back?
Clint, Rob Jones, Pickens County. Going back to the appraisal issue, is the state legislature looking back at what they did to us last year, to the fact that on foreclosed properties, what they were bringing on the board on the courthouse steps was the appraisal values of those foreclosed properties are dropping down, even though it's still costing you somewhere about $100 a square foot to build a house. It's kind of put the counties in a tight. I don't know if any of them here, any of these individuals sitting here, have had to sit in a millage rate increase meeting with their public. But when you have to deal with that, that sure does make it rough on the commissioners when you have to go sit to those meetings and you have to argue the fact that, yeah, you get 50 cents on the dollar for a house, but yet the appraised value has dropped down. Now you got a neighbor next door that he wants his value dropped because of the appraised value of that foreclosed property.
Yeah, there's been actually quite a bit of discussion in the legislature about that topic. For those of you that aren't familiar, at one time in the law it said that assessors shall consider those types of sales. Excuse me, it said they may consider those types of sales, and now it says they shall consider those. They said shall actually apply those sales. I'm not going to have time to get into the details of that, but there's different types of sales: a bank sale versus a short sale versus the foreclosure sale. But at the end of the day, what they're trying to get at is if it's on the open market and anybody has the opportunity to buy it, then from the legislator's perspective, they think that ought to be factored into your tax digest. But if it's, you know, the bank just buying back the property, you shouldn't be counting that. If they're taking it back for what's owed on it. But typically, they're taking them back for what's owed, which is higher than what they actually sell it for when they turn around and sell it. So that's actually usually the lower value. It's a problem. Hopefully, as the real estate market turns around, that it won't be an issue. But as far as trying to unwind that at the legislature, I can tell you that politically, that's going to be a very tough sell with the legislature. But it is something that's on our legislative agenda. We can talk more about that later. I've mentioned ag preferential. So exemptions, we've talked a little bit about exemptions. Obviously, the main one is the homestead exemptions, and we've got all sorts of flavors of homestead exemptions. Somebody in the back that thought they had an assessment freeze, what they had was a floating homestead exemption, and there's all flavors of those. So these are things you can really design them. You can design them to give benefit to the older retirees in the community. You can give benefit to people that make certain amounts of income. You can structure it any way you want, up to 100%. But the one point I want to make here is to do any of this, it first requires a local act from your delegation at the General Assembly. So you can't do it on your own. And then it requires a vote in a referendum. So you can't create any homestead exemption on your own. You've got to have your legislative delegation on board, and you have to have your voters on board. There's a question back here?
Yes, Donald Watson from Twiggs County. Regarding foreclosed sales, the Appraisal Foundation has ruled that appraisers must consider foreclosed homes. Now, when the bank takes it back, they have to purchase it, so that doesn't show up in that pool.
Right.
Also, regarding earlier, you mentioned manufacturer mobile homes. There is a standard for whether or not it's real or personal. And that standard is if the title has been retired and is still retired, then it is real property. If it is not, it's personal and is not subject to exemption, a homestead exemption.
That's a good point. Are you a former appraiser? Current one? Good.
I'm a current certified general.
Great. Freeport, I've already mentioned this. We got a new Freeport called Freeport 2. But this is dealing with business inventory. Most all y'all have Freeport 1, which is like warehouse goods that are in transition or manufactured goods that are coming out of your manufacturing plants. And then you got different types of exempt properties. You got charitable properties, you got churches. You know, you can, if you want to give a tax break to, say, a manufacturer, then you can do it by going through your development authority, because as long as the development authority is holding that title, then you can exempt part of the property taxes. If there's a lease arrangement is how it works. So the development authority is holding title, and then the company is paying the lease on it, and eventually the company owns the property outright. And so they pay a little bit more every year on that lease, which is basically to replace some of the lost property taxes. But it gives them, it's a way to grant them a property tax break, but it has to be done through the development authority. Somebody had a question over here? Yeah. Ooh, I'm out of time.
Doug Luke with Jasper County. This is a question, and I guess, what would be your best response to this question? Were you sitting where the commissioners were? We were in a meeting, and one of our citizens made the observation that the home values have dropped roughly in the neighborhood of 25%, yet the adjustment from the county only ended up about 3%. And his deal was, you know, why aren't y'all doing more to meet us in the middle? How would you address that?
Well, you as a county commissioner can't really do a lot. You can appoint board members to the Board of Assessors when those positions come open, but once you've appointed them, or once somebody else prior to you has appointed them, they can't be removed without going to a Superior Court judge, and you've got to show malfeasance of office, and that's very difficult to do. So all you can really do is coach them on what they need to do to file an appeal in the whole appeals process. If they're not being treated fairly, they need to go through that appeals process, and you need to educate them on that. Okay, guys, I'm way over time. Actually, it's time right now, so I gotta let you go here. But I just wanted to, sales tax is very important. Lost, that's your rollback against property taxes countywide. Host is a rollback against only homesteaded property. SPLOST is very important. We have a SPLOST guide. I encourage you to get a copy of that SPLOST guide. We're updating it right now. But it's important every time you go out with a SPLOST referendum that you've read that guide and understand it thoroughly. They got the new T-SPLOST. Y'all probably heard about that. It passed in 3 regions. For those of you that are in regions where it didn't pass, there's opportunity to bring that back on the ballot at a future date, but that's for transportation purposes. Other taxes, insurance premium tax. That is collected by the insurance commissioner, and it's allocated to counties and cities based on a population formula. You get it every year. I think it's October, September that you get the check. You're supposed to use it for providing services in your unincorporated area. If you have no services that are primarily provided just to unincorporated residents, then you can do the rollback on the county M&O levy in the unincorporated area. That's the only situation where your county M&O levy may be different from the incorporated to the unincorporated areas. That's the only situation where it ought to be different. And that is provided for by the state constitution. It allows you to do that. Business occupation taxes. Oh, by the way, anybody think we have business license? Anybody have a business license? Raise your hand. Business licenses? No, there is no business license in the state of Georgia. You find me where it says business license in state law. You can't do it. We don't have licenses. That's a misnomer. Some of you call it that. Some of you may even put it on the bill, but that's not what we have. You can't regulate. Now, the Secretary of State has regulating powers over certain businesses, and you can regulate them through zoning and some other things, but you can't go padlock their doors if they don't pay this. This is a tax. Now, you can go after them, but it is clearly a business occupation tax. financial institutions tax on your banks. So the point I want to make here, check and see if you're collecting this throughout the entire county, including the incorporated areas, because I found that counties were only collecting this in the unincorporated area. Unlike business occupation taxes, where you can only collect it in the unincorporated area, this one you can collect in the incorporated area also. So you should be collecting it from the banks regardless of whether they're in the city or in the unincorporated area. No, not the FDIC. Your banks are supposed to pay this. Yeah, if their banks have gone out of business, then they've been acquired probably by somebody. Alcoholic beverage taxes for those of you that have that. Of course, now we have Sunday sales. I'm not going to go into that, but it's, liquor by the drink. It's beer, wine. There's different rates for the different types of alcohol. You got the hotel motel tax. The base rate's 3%, but a lot of you have got legislation passed to allow you to go higher than 3%. You can only collect that in your unincorporated area unless your cities are not collecting it in the city. Some new taxes. I could spend all day just talking about A, which I'm not going to be able to do, but you all need to know about this one. This is coming March 1 of next year, new vehicle title tax. Property taxes on vehicles that are acquired after March 1 of next year, going away. Sales taxes paid on vehicles purchased after March 1 of next year, going away. They're both being replaced with the new vehicle title tax. People that bought this year between January 1 and March 1 of next year have an opt-in. So if you just recently bought a vehicle, count yourself lucky because you can opt into the new program without having to pay the title tax potentially next year. You need to know about that. Your taxpayer is going to ask you about that. You're going to start hearing a lot more about it. The media really hasn't covered this, but this is a major, major change to the way we tax vehicles in the state of Georgia. And it's going to affect people differently. Let me tell you who the winner is. The winner, if you buy your car used or new from a dealer, you're going to come out better in this system. If you lease your vehicle, if you buy from buy here, pay here because you don't have good credit, if you're moving in from out of state, if you buy on Craigslist, a private sale, and don't hold your vehicle for very long, you're a loser. So, winners and losers. This is going to really change things, and you all need to understand it. We'll have a class on it. Energy excise tax. That's something that hopefully your Board of Commissioners is talking about right now because this thing goes into effect January 1. After January 1 of next year, they're going to start phasing out local and state sales tax on energy use in manufacturing. If you've got a lot of manufacturing in your county, this could have a dramatic impact on your loss and splost. And you have the opportunity to replace that revenue, but politically you're in the hot seat. You've got to impose this energy excise tax at the same rate as what you're losing and make that decision. I'm not going to have a chance to get into fees, user fees, but there's a whole lot of them. Again, we could spend probably a week on all these topics. But you as elected officials and as policymakers, you're going to be asked these questions by your businesses, by your constituents. So you really need to understand where you're getting your revenues from in the county and understand what you can use those revenues for. Because unlike the state, where most of their revenues go in the general fund, some of your revenues are restricted. SPLOST is restricted, hotel motel tax is restricted, insurance premium tax is restricted, on and on and on. They all have their own set of rules. You all need to understand those rules. I hope this has been beneficial, and Murray, I apologize, I know I've gone over, but this is important stuff, and I hope you guys will continue to educate yourself on the different types of revenues that you levy at the county level.